All right, rejoining the channel, two-time Moochie Award-winning Professor Justin Bronk of the Royal United Services Institute, beaming in live from London. Justin, that's a different backdrop. Are you at home, or is this a room you haven't used at ROSI before? Where are you?
Sadly, this is significantly more grand than my room, but I'm visiting relatives, so I'm elsewhere in the UK.
It's been a few weeks since we've talked about the war in Ukraine. There have been a number of headlines associated with it, and I wanted to get your thoughts on each of these, starting with this recent announcement that Sweden has signed a letter of intent to sell 100 to 150 Gripens to Ukraine after President Zelensky visited Saab's Linköping factory. Over the years, we've talked about type model series in great detail. How do you feel about this particular arrangement, and what will it do with respect to the war effort?
So I'm a little bit split, if I'm honest. On the one hand, this is, to my mind at least, undoubtedly the most well-suited new production fighter option that is available to Ukraine theoretically for their medium to long-term requirements. The Gripen E, the Echo model, which is the recently established new production version, it can be thought of in some ways pretty similar to a Super Hornet compared to a regular Hornet. It looks similar from outside. It's got the same sort of outer mold line shape, but it's about 25 to 30% bigger and heavier. It actually shares the same engines with Legacy and Super Hornet. So the Gripen CD has a Volvo license manufactured version of the F404 that the Hornet has two of. And the Gripen Echo has the F414 that the Super Hornet has, so there's more commonality there. So it is similar looking, but actually to all intents and purposes a new aeroplane compared to the Gripen CD. In terms of capabilities, significantly better than anything that they're operating with the F-16 AB MLU standard that they've received from the Dutch, from the Norwegians, Danes, and soon to be Belgians, and then the French supplied Mirage 2000-5s that they've got, and certainly than any of the legacy Soviet equipment. So in that sense, it will be a significant capability uplift. It has a modern AESA radar, a really superb internal electronic warfare suite for self-protection, very specifically optimized around Russian fire control radars. So yeah, that should be very well suited to their needs, and it's compatible with the Meteor missile. So if that's supplied as well, and that's an if, that would give them the long-range capabilities to hold those glide bomb launching and Su-35 caps at threat from relatively low level, relatively near the front lines, which is something that AMRAAM can't do, and neither can Mica, which is the missile that the Mirage 2000s have, which we've discussed before. So in that sense, it's all to the good, and it's also a system. The Gripen system is extremely good for getting the best out of relatively inexperienced pilots. Given a lot of these pilots will have to be freshly trained, because Ukraine is running on a pretty small pool of combat experienced pilots at this stage after a lot of attrition over the years, and a lot of those that are left have gone to F-16 or Mirage, and so they're not going to go across to Gripen, at least not immediately. And so, for relatively freshly trained crews, the degree of automation of a lot of the information with which fighter pilots do mental processing, whether that's fuel flow, weapon envelopes, relative aspect, closure, altitude, speed, compared to their formation and targets, the Gripen automates a huge amount of that for you. And so it's an easier platform if you're learning from scratch to get really tactically good at, compared to a lot of other Western equivalents. So that's great. And it should share the same benefits that the CD offers, which has always made it, in my mind, the obvious choice for Ukraine, of being very easy to maintain compared to most jets, very rugged, designed for short, rough field operations, and to be maintained by small teams of conscripts off mobile vehicles. So all of that's good. The flip side is that this is new production. 100 to 150 airplanes will take a while. And the Swedish political side, talking at the conference, we're talking about delivery dates starting in maybe 3 years' time. So up front, it's not going to do a huge amount to help Ukraine in the current fight. The flip side, potentially, to some of that is that Zelensky himself was talking about potential deliveries in 2026, and alluding to the fact that has been sort of surfaced in some public documents a few times over the past couple of years, that Ukrainian pilots and ground crews have already been training on the Gripen in Sweden and have been for some time. Well, that 2026 timeframe could only be met by the CD. So the existing Gripen, classic Gripen, of which some reserves do exist in Sweden, and there are a few whitetails around, and there are also some on lease to various air forces that you could potentially see as part of some sort of agreement to swap, if those countries were willing to do so. One of them's Hungary, so probably not, but there are potential options. And so it's possible that part of this deal that is not announced or approved yet is that in the interim, Ukraine might receive a relatively small number of Gripen CDs in the 2026 timeframe, maybe. Swedish sources have denied that there's any agreement on that. So it certainly sounds like if there is such a deal in the works, it's not done and dusted. But that would be the only way that I can see of significantly improving the Ukrainian fighter forces' ability to counter one of its primary threats, which is currently glide bomb launches from Su-34s from 60 to 80, sometimes even 100 kilometers behind the lines, and of course Su-35s and occasionally Su-57s on cap, again at high altitude, usually about 60 or more kilometers behind the lines. So a few Gripen CDs with Meteor, again, if it were supplied, could potentially threaten them while remaining relatively low risk, low level near the front lines, in a way that Ukraine's existing fighters can't. If that is part of the eventual deal, that would be great. If not, then this is a good medium to long-term sign for the future of the Ukrainian Air Force. But if it's just the Gripen Echo, then that coming to fruition is dependent on an acceptable end to the war being reached, and Ukraine surviving essentially as a sovereign and viable entity until delivery start in 3 years or so. And there's still not currently a visible path to that without significant additional pressure on the Russian oil and gas exports and more sanctions, and continuing to support Ukraine from European and US purchases, European equipment and European purchases of US equipment, which we're doing. So it's not to say there's no way there, but that's by no means guaranteed.
Reporting on current events like the war in Ukraine is challenging because the situation is very fluid and chaotic at times. So let me tell you about a resource that I depend on as I attempt to provide an unbiased point of view: Ground News. I start my day by going to the Ground News homepage, and in this case, we type Ukraine in the search box and see a number of topics in the dropdown. Let's click on Zelensky attends London Coalition of the Willing meeting. Clicking on that gets us to this landing page that features a bulletized summary of the topic curated using Ground News' proprietary Ground AI Insights. Over on the right, we see that there are 82 articles on this topic, and down here we see an infographic with the bias distribution. Let's compare two headlines. First one is from the French newspaper Le Monde with very high factuality and leans left. We click on it and the article comes right up. After we read that one, it's easy to click back and find another with a different bias. In this case, the South China Morning Post, owned by the Alibaba Group, with high factuality and center bias. We click on that one and again, it pops right up. You can't get this amount of information organized like this anywhere else. Go to ground.news/ward or scan the QR code on the screen. If you use my link, you can get 40% off unlimited access, which is the Vantage plan that I use. Again, that's ground.news/ward or scan the QR code. The link is in the episode description below, so check it out. So you mentioned the oil and gas sanctioned. That was a function of the called off meeting that was imminent between Trump and Putin, which Trump described now as a wasted meeting. So those direct talks that follow the direct talks that happened in Alaska a few months ago. And as a result of that meeting being called off, Trump announced sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which is Russia's two largest oil companies. Putin dismissed that move as ineffective, and in response to that, Trump said, quote, "I'm glad he feels that way. I'll let you know in about 6 months. Let's see how it all works out," end quote. So what do you think this round of sanctions, particularly aimed at those two big oil companies, is doing to Putin's willingness to continue the war, among other things?
Well, I think it's potentially quite significant if essentially secondary sanctions are actually followed through on. So it's one thing to sanction these entities, but where that becomes really powerful is in the implementation. If, in particular, the US and, of course, European entities within the European Central Bank, which would, but if US entities specifically then follow through with, for example, cutting out companies in India, companies in Hungary, companies in all over the world, in third-party nations, in some cases some quite powerful ones, who buy Russian oil and gas from Rosneft and Lukoil and others that are now sanctioned, because doing so will cause significant political problems with those countries. On the other hand, the US has the clout to be able to do that, and the current administration. One thing you can say about it is it doesn't seem to particularly mind causing diplomatic problems with all sorts of countries if it decides that it has an interest in doing so. So, if those secondary sanctions are followed through on with these this new round on Russian oil and gas exporters, then that could really have a significant economic impact, because while Russia might have been able to improve its sanctions resistance over time, those entities, for example, and Indian oil and gas importers and Indian banks that finance them, and they can't afford to be cut off from the global financial system by being placed under US sanction or European sanction, and so this could really significantly impact the Russian economy if it's enforced. The same is true for what we're starting to see really positive signs on over the last month or so, of multiple countries starting to put pressure on the Russian shadow fleet. So the not necessarily illegally, but certainly inaccurately registered, so false flagged and often uninsured and non-environmental compliance meeting tankers, which conduct quite a lot of Russia's illicit oil export trade. And so again, one doesn't have to particularly escalate, as it were, to go after that stuff, because all you have to do is stop them, inspect them, and demand to see correct and valid insurance paperwork, flagging paperwork of where they're from, prove that they are within compliance for things like emissions and pollution standards, which generally they're not. And so you can tie them up for months and delay and cause huge friction in that without ever doing anything overtly aggressive. The problem is, if individual countries do that on individual tankers, they tend to get a very, very rapid Russian, sometimes military response, as we saw against Estonian naval vessels that tried it recently. So you saw Russian Navy, Russian Air Force respond very quickly out of Kaliningrad, but also things like cyber attacks, sabotage against infrastructure. So what that means is it has to be a coordinated response with multiple nations doing it. But you are starting to see some good signs of that over the past month. You're seeing French action in that regard, Finnish, Danish, the Estonians trying again with one of the Russian tankers. So, yeah, I think there's some positive signs, and that really is the main lever that the US and European allies have, aside from just trying to keep Ukraine in the fight with supplies, to force the Russians to actually negotiate. Their economy really is in trouble, and they haven't managed to break Ukrainian lines over the summer, which was a risk. And if we go into mud season, hopefully it rains and seriously rains, so that movement becomes much more difficult. Given the Russians are still on the offensive, that would buy Ukraine a bit of space. Yeah, pressure on the Russian economy could seriously work, and particularly in the context where the sustained Ukrainian campaign against Russian oil and gas refineries is having a significant effect. It has cumulatively hit up to 30% of Russia's refining capacity. And so you're starting to see huge queues at petrol stations running out in a nation that has been famously described as a gas station with nukes. It's quite serious for the Russians, and this represents a vast proportion of their government incomes, revenue streams. So, yeah, I think it depends whether the administration actually follows through with that pressure, that is the route to bring the Russians to an actual negotiation that isn't just them stalling for time while they continue to try and overrun Ukrainian positions.
So we mentioned that President Zelensky was in Sweden this week. He was also in the UK. Before that, week prior, he was in Washington, D.C., and among the agenda items for that meeting was an ask for TLAM, for Tomahawk. And when President Putin got word that that was part of the ask, he very publicly pushed back and threatened that that would be an absolute red line for him. I don't know if that affected Trump's decision. Certainly, he has been deferential to a degree of Putin's attitudes towards things in the past. But in any case, Zelensky left D.C. without any TLAM. And I know that also under that header of Tomahawk's, long-range cruise missiles is Storm Shadow, the UK variant. Would TLAM be any manner of game changer if they were given to Ukraine?
The primary thing that TLAM would offer that Storm Shadow doesn't is range. So Storm Shadow or Scalp NG in its French form, they're basically the same missile, are, in broad terms, lower signature. So the radar cross-section is lower, and depending on which version of TLAM you're talking about, they might also fly lower, for example, when they're terrain masking, or terrain following. So Storm Shadow and Scalp you would expect to be slightly better in aggregate or slightly more difficult for Russian air defenses to successfully track and engage, than TLAM, which doesn't have notable stealth features. On the other hand, TLAM offers really significantly better range, depending on variant. Some variants, I believe, have up to 2,500 kilometers, but even the standard variants have kind of 1,500-ish kilometer ranges, whereas Storm Shadow is less than 500, partly to comply with the missile technology control regime. But so TLAM would potentially offer the capacity to threaten targets much deeper inside Russia, including, for example, targets around Moscow, or which Ukraine can't reach with Storm Shadow and has reached periodically with small UAVs, but they carry a tiny payload and are not particularly accurate, whereas Tomahawk is very accurate in terminal phase and can carry a pretty significant warhead, much more so than one-way attack UAVs. So the sorts of targets you could credibly threaten, if you could hit them, are much more potentially significant than Ukraine's one-way attack UAVs. On the other hand, you would never have been talking about significant numbers, really. I mean, you'd been probably talking tens, partly because the US doesn't have nearly enough TLAM for what Indo-PACOM would like to have, Indo-Pacific Command in the Indo-Pacific. Obviously, for any conflict with China or Chinese forces, the long-range precision capabilities of Tomahawk, that is primarily a naval missile launched from submarines or surface ships, would be one of the US's primary weapon systems in the Indo-Pacific. And Chinese forces being as large as they are and missile defense capabilities being as good as they are, you could almost never have enough. And it probably doesn't help that CENTCOM has used a lot of TLAM, arguably against target sets that might not necessarily have warranted it, particularly against the Houthis while trying to suppress their anti-ship operations in the Red Sea. And also, of course, we saw significant use of TLAM against Iranian nuclear sites in the strike alongside B-2s against the buried sites. So the US has expended a fair bit of TLAM recently. And so, there is an argument of, well, we need it ourselves kind of thing. I don't think in reality a few tens of TLAMs would significantly affect US readiness, but you probably wouldn't have been looking at numbers much in excess of that. And in any case, you would need a land-based launcher, and there aren't a huge number of those. It's a relatively new system. I think it's called the Tornado, the land-based US Army launcher. So would it change the course of the war? No, probably not. Would it be a significant headache for the Russians? Yes. Firstly, they've always been scared of TLAM. They have a particular issue with TLAM because of its range and because it can be launched from submarines. So potentially could come from, an Arctic vector, for example, They've always been worried about the fact that it places a lot of their otherwise relatively invulnerable military installations and potentially political or command and control installations at risk, at least theoretically. And because Russia is so huge, they can't put air defense around everything, especially now that they've had significant attrition on their air defenses around Ukraine, and there's such a high demand for their air defense coverage around Ukraine to contain the regular UAV strike waves. So yeah, it would be a headache for them. It would certainly appear that President Trump's line view of his consideration of TLAM, which the administration was quite open about, it was interesting, seems to have changed pretty abruptly after his call with President Putin. He's not wrong when he says that the mission planning and the operation of it's very complicated. It is. TLAM is it's a relatively simple thing to fire, but the mission planning is pretty complicated and relies on being able to do some pretty complicated route planning because of the way it works. So yeah, it's not an easy thing to put into service, and there might be degrees of support required that they're uncomfortable with, or at least, if not, significant training periods that would mean it wouldn't be an immediate way to put pressure on the Russians. So yeah, I think there's a focus on TLAM on both the Western side and the Ukrainian side, and on the Russian side, that is probably more about its political significance rather than its operational impact. But in a scenario where there's desperate attempts to put pressure on the Russians to actually negotiate, having something in play, or putting something in play, as it were, that the Russians really have a particular problem with and fear of, again, is certainly a way to increase pressure. And I've seen a few suggestions in various places that it would be a strategically unstable thing to do, because theoretically some of the US nuclear arsenal involves air-launched cruise missiles, or used to. I don't think that's realistic, in the sense that there's no suggestion that there would be any kind of nuclear consideration given, nor that the Russians believe that there would be any sort of nuclear warhead consideration given. So yeah, I don't think that strategic stability side of things is really a decent argument. And once again, it is worth reminding oneself that every single thing that the Russians have said would be a major red line and trigger some usually unspecified or sometimes explicitly nuclear retaliatory threat. When it's actually been done, there's been no response. And that was, anti-tank guided missiles for Ukraine before the invasion, manpads for Ukraine just before the invasion, and then immediately afterwards, main battle tanks for Ukraine, F-16s for Ukraine, ATACMS for Ukraine, GIMLRs for Ukraine. In every case, the Russians have said this would be a huge red line for us and there'd be these terrible escalatory consequences. And then when they've been given, nothing's happened.
So you mentioned the drone, the one-way attack drone use. There have been back and forth in recent days, Russians attacking civilian population centers in the West. And this is in addition to what we've discussed of tactical drone use in the Donbass. And then Ukraine, you mentioned that Storm Shadow can't get all the way to Moscow, but these drones can, and they just launched a couple of missions, one against a gas plant and then one against an apartment building in the Moscow area. Again, do we believe that the persistent targeting, the deep strike, let's say, on Russia by Ukrainian drones has any mental morale effect on the Russian population?
I expect it has some effect on the Russian population, in the sense that, particularly for those living in the western parts of Russia, it is a relatively frequent reminder that the war is not something that just happens a long way away in that place called Ukraine. And so, as a reminder to ordinary Russians that the war has a cost, especially now that it's starting to have a very visible impact on the availability and price of fuel for ordinary Russians, that's got to be a good thing, in the sense of trying to put political pressure on the Russian regime to stop the war. And remember, of course, this notion that it's both sides. If the Russians decide to freeze the lines today and say, okay, we'll stop, then the fighting stops. That's it. I mean, whereas if the Ukrainians decide to stop fighting, then they'll be completely overrun. There is no equivalence here. except that it's very useful for the Russians to continue to obfuscate by pushing the line that, oh, well, the Ukrainians aren't interested in negotiations. This is just not true. The Russians have, as the undisputable aggressor, have entirely the power to stop this whenever they want. So putting pressure on them through the population has some benefit, but ultimately there isn't much way for the population to express discontent in Russia because there is no meaningful democracy there, and there's also incredible amounts of state repressive capacity, so any protests tend to be crushed very quickly. The more immediate benefit to the Ukrainian strike operations ongoing against the Russian oil and gas industry is that it hurts Russia's ability to fund the war effort over time. It's putting very significant pressure on its economy, and it also significantly hurts the personal bank balance, as it were, of the Russian leadership, because it is a kleptocracy, and the primary people who own controlling shares in a lot of the oil and gas industry are the same people who run the country, the Siloviki. So in that sense, it directly pressures the Russian leadership in a way that hurts them financially, as these companies lose value. So, it has a function. It is also having significant effect in terms of putting strain on the Russian air defense network. They are having to expend an enormous amount of ammunition, particularly in short-range systems, like the Pantsir and the Tor, to intercept these strikes with regularly hundreds of one-way attack UAVs. So just the same as the hundreds of Geberas and Shaheds are putting significant pressure on the Ukrainian air defense system, I should say Garan 2s and 3s rather than Shaheds, because they're now almost exclusively made in Russia, and therefore they are Garan 2s and 3s, not Shaheds. But yeah, just as that's putting real pressure on the Ukrainian air defense network, so is the Ukrainian one-way attack campaign putting pressure on the Russian one, albeit the Russians have a much deeper magazine, particularly for their long-range systems like S-400, than Ukraine does for its Patriot and NASAMS systems, and also just a huge amount more air defense capability. But it's a bigger place, so they have to spread it out more. So yeah, it has some impact. The Ukrainians are having significant success against the Geberas and the Garans, with both their increasing number of domestically and partner-produced UAV interceptors, so little UAVs or sort of propeller-powered missiles that go up and either directly collide with or explode next to Shaheds and Garans, trying to do so at a relatively comparable or lower price point. So some of those are working quite well, others less so, but they're scaling up the production of the ones that are working well as fast as they can, aiming for thousands a week, which is what they need. The effective range of these sort of drone interceptors is very small, but if you have enough of them, then the odds that any individual Garan or Shahed or Gebera crossing the coverage of at least one or two of them is pretty high once you have enough of them. It's a bit like manpads in that respect. And that's helping to save what ammunition there is for the NASAMS, the IRIS-T, the Patriot, for the cruise and ballistic missiles. Those cruise and ballistic missiles continue to improve. The Russians continue to improve the countermeasures, both physical and electronic. And particularly the ballistics are getting harder to intercept. They are maneuvering better in the terminal phase. They've had plenty of, hundreds and hundreds of engagements worth of data now, so they're working out what works and what doesn't for getting things through to targets. And again, the countermeasures are continuing to improve, so need to continue to update Patriot and NASAMS to keep them effective against these sort of things over time. And the F-16s and Mirage 2000s are having success against the cruise missiles to some degree, and also the Garans, although they're not really sustainable for shooting down those. But it's a pretty expensive way of doing that. And the other final bit is against the one-way attack UAVs is actually the Ukrainians are having a lot of shoot downs. It's not the primary mode, but quite a lot of shoot downs with helicopters and with light aircraft with machine guns. So both helicopter gunships, the Mi-24 Hinds with their nose-mounted cannons, and also with Mi-8 or 17 transport helicopters with door gunners and a sensible under the nose to help them track and identify them at night. And the Yak-52 and other kind of light aircraft and transport aircraft that have been adapted with machine guns or people even with assault rifles in the back cockpit. But it's dangerous work. They're using every tool in the arsenal, if that makes sense.
Well, Justin, as always, thank you for your insights. You're a busy guy, and we appreciate you joining us here today.
My pleasure.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.